Hello, reader friends. I am so excited to read an excerpt from Hope in the Mountain River today. This is book 2 in my Call of the Rockies series, and it's my most recent release. And if we're ready, let's get started. This is one of my favorite series, and I love this book. Okay, Chapter 1, December 1830, Bitterroot Mountains, future Montana Territory. Is he friend or enemy? Ellen's blood pounded through her veins, as it did when the warriors from her tribe struck their targets with tomahawks. Blow upon blow, louder and louder with each passing moment. She pulled her furs tighter around her shivering shoulders, against the bitter wind whipping down the mountainside. I can't tell. Her faithful friend Maxim paused. Then a tiny gasp slipped from her mouth in an icy cloud. It's a white man. The shock in her voice thrust the words to a dangerously low whisper. A French trapper? Elin softened her own tone so she didn't alert the stranger of their presence. The trappers were the only Soyapo who ever came to the Bitterroot Mountains. White people, they called themselves, from the northern country. She'd heard them speak of a place called Canada. Enough of these men had visited their camp that she'd become accustomed to their strange manners and learned some of their words. I don't know. There are 2 of them. No? Another pause. If only Elin had a clear view herself. She forced her legs to relax around her horse's sides. Everything in her wanted to ride the few steps forward beside her best friend and peek through the trees to see the outsiders for herself. But even that small movement could alert the strangers to their presence. Better to keep themselves hidden until they knew better what manner of persons they were up against. With all her training among the braves, Maxim could likely protect the 2 of them from any harm these foreigners might plan. But sometimes stealth was a better feat than courage, especially for 2 women alone in the mountains, facing white men who surely carried guns. The emptiness in Elin's heart had stripped away any caution for herself, but for her friend she had to be diligent. She couldn't lose Maxim, not to beast or man. Elin's eyes lifted to the angry gray sky. The coming weather couldn't be battled, though. The clop of horses' hooves thumped loudly in the icy air as the strangers drew near. There must be more than 2 traveling, as much noise as their animals created. Finally, Maxim drew back from her perch among the cluster of trees and turned to face Elin. Instead of speaking aloud, she used the language of signs to share what she'd seen. 4 men and a woman. A woman? Elin's breath caught in her chest. These people must be friendly then, unless the woman was a captive. She made the motions to ask, all of them are white? Maxim shook her head. Her hands flew as she answered, all but 1 man. He is not of the people, not Shoshone either. Elin's heart stilled as fear clutched her throat. Blackfoot? Even as she signed the question, her mind revolted against the answer. The Blackfoot were one of her people's most dangerous enemies. The stories of how they'd taken women and children captive and the awful way they treated them as slaves had been shared as warning in every lodge. I don't know. Maxim's answer only stilled a small bit of churning in Elin's middle. Maybe the man was Salish or one of the other friendly tribes. After all, why would a Blackfoot brave be traveling so far south in the winter moons, especially traveling with a band of white people? Her friend turned back to watch the strangers, and Elin braced herself for her first glimpse as the nose of a horse appeared between the trees. The moment Maxim had first caught the sound of riders approaching, Elin had spotted this perfect place to watch the strangers while keeping the 2 of them and their horses hidden. The first sight she caught was of a horse with a long winter coat that had once been black, but long days in the sun had bleached the ends lighter brown. Its rider came into view, and something in Elin's middle tightened. He wore a fur coat and hat, much like the French trappers did, and she couldn't see much of his face except a glimpse of paler skin, the color of a white man's. Yet something in his manner, maybe in his bearing, the way he sat atop his horse, struck a yearning inside her. He rode like a horseman, one capable of communing with his mount and moving as one. She'd seen this among some of the braves in their camp. After all, her people were known for their skill with horses and the unique spotted animals they raised. But she'd never seen a man who gripped her attention at first glance like this one. When he'd nearly ridden past, She caught sight of the man riding behind him. This one truly did look like a Frenchman, much like the trapper LeBeau who'd spent a winter in the lodge beside their own a few years back. After the second man, a female passed by, a white squaw with light brown hair, dressed in a beautiful set of buckskins and covered in a cape of fine wolf fur. She sat regally in the saddle. No mere serving girl, this one, nor a captive. Another horse climbed the trail close behind her, and the sight of raven hair poking out from under his fur cap made her chest tighten again. She couldn't see much of the man's face, only enough to agree that he was from one of the tribes. But which one? The risk of showing themselves to find out wasn't worth any gain that might come from a meeting. Maxim knew the trail the two of them were following, as she'd passed through here several times on hunting trips, and they'd packed enough food to reach the great river. The only reason to reveal themselves would be curiosity to see what these people were about. Definitely not worth the risk. After all, hadn't Elin chosen to take this journey to escape from people? Time alone was what she'd craved. Time to heal, if that were possible. Maxim knew how to keep silent and was an able guide and friend, so accepting her insistence on coming along hadn't been too hard. Yet the long days of quiet hadn't eased the rending of Elin's body and heart yet. Nothing ever could. Not when her daughter's life had been crushed, ripped into bloody shreds by a single horrific act. Chuslam had tried to save her. He'd done everything he could to rescue their only child, but his efforts hadn't been enough. No one could best a grizzly with only his hands, not even a brave as skilled as her husband had been. Now Elin was alone. In one awful day she'd been stripped of the two people who'd mattered most to her. How could she possibly go on? What was there without her child to give her life meaning? Another man rode into view, bringing her focus back to the present. This stranger sat taller than the others, almost bear-like, wrapped in his furs. At least they'd all dressed suitably for travel through the deadly winter in these mountains. The snow only came above the horses' knees for now, but the low, thick clouds meant more would be falling soon. This group must not have seen the cave they had to have passed early in the day, or they would have taken shelter. She and Maxim were riding hard to reach that cave before the worst of the snow came in a fury. When the last pack horse marched past their hiding place, Elin forced her mind to focus on sounds around them. The horses' hooves crunching snow, the squeaking of saddles. One of the men murmured, but the group had moved far enough away that she couldn't make out words, not even what language it might be. At last, silence descended over the land, settling on them like a heavy shroud. Pressing so hard she had to work to draw breath. Why did this quiet she'd craved now feel like the press of death? Maxim turned, and her perceptive gaze roamed over Elin's face. Elin turned away from her friend toward the eastern path they'd been riding. Ready? Her friend nudged her mount forward. If we ride hard, we'll reach the cave before the snow comes. This will be a deep one. Maxim was right, no doubt. Yet the fury of the oncoming blizzard was nothing compared to the desolation left by the storm raging inside her. Joel Vargas eyed the darkening sky overhead, then signaled for a halt as he reined his gelding in. That storm will strike any minute, no? From behind him, French peered up at the low clouds pressing down on them. Joel scanned the rest of the group, Susanna, Beavertail, then Caleb in the rear. All these people he dragged into these treacherous Bitterroot Mountains. He'd expected the terrain to be rough, the cliffs steep, and the footing dangerous. But he'd not expected the cold to be so fierce a man could freeze to death in an hour unless he bundled tight in furs. And the snow already stood as high as the horses' knees. Now they were about to get more? He'd never imagined such a place existed when he left Andalusia. The mountains in his Spanish homeland, at least where he and his brother had grown up, rose in majestic grandeur just as these did, but the climate was so much more agreeable. None of this frostbite and limbs so cold he didn't dare make water until he first built a warming campfire. We passed a cave a few hours back. That would be a good place to wait out the storm. Beavertail spoke in his usual reserved manner. Joel jerked his gaze to the man. Why didn't you say something when you saw it? And why hadn't Joel seen it himself? How did Beaver always manage to be one step ahead, even when Joel did his best to keep every one of his senses alert? Beaver sent a glance around them, ever watchful. "I didn't think you'd want to wait half a day just to keep from riding in snowflakes." The pressure in his chest pinched harder. Did his friends think him such a dictator he would risk their lives just to make a half-day's progress in their trek? Yes, this journey was important. Every half-day could mean life or death for his brother, the brother he hadn't seen in over a year now. He didn't actually know if Adam was in danger. He only suspected so because Adam's note had said he'd find Joel in the summer, about 5 months ago. While Joel had no certain knowledge of Adam's peril, he did know that this snowstorm could be the death of them all if they didn't find proper shelter and a dry place for a fire. Reining his horse around, he nodded toward Caleb. "Let's retrace our steps. We won't find Adam if we all turn to icicles." The next hours dragged on as the temperature dropped. Not even the majestic views surrounding them, peaks rising up like cathedrals into the clouds, could overcome the miserable cold. "Behind those 2 boulders just ahead of you." Beavertail's voice broke the interminable silence. Joel craned his neck to see the cave his friend had spotted. He rode in the back of the line now, so he didn't get a glimpse of the opening until the others had reined their horses in a semicircle around the spot. 2 stones stood as tall as men, palace guards in front of the cave's entrance, permitting access only through the narrow space between them. He could see why most people wouldn't notice the dark hole hiding behind the rocks. But he should have seen it. He'd spent his life watching for danger, trying to spot potential hazards and possible protection. How had he missed this? Beavertail had already dropped to the ground and padded forward to slip between the stone barriers, ever the scout and protector. Joel gripped his rifle as he slid from his own mount and stepped forward to follow his friend. Surely Beaver knew the chance that a bear or other animal had taken refuge inside. But just in case, Joel asked the question. "Think anything is in there?" Beaver didn't even slow, just tipped his chin to throw his voice back to Joel. "Mayhap." He was prepared then. With the gun in Joel's left hand, he gripped the hilt of his knife with his right and followed his half-Blackfoot friend through the boulders. Joel could shoot a gun with decent aim, but he'd spent so many long hours on the ship from Andalusia, perfecting his skills with the blade, he'd be quicker with that weapon in an attack. Beavertail slipped into the darkness of the cave without a pause, even though the interior yawned black. Joel pulled out his knife, but kept the blade pointed downward as he used the fist of that hand to feel the air in front of him. Better not to run into anything. Every one of his senses strained to hear a sound or catch a whiff of odor, something other than the dank scent of damp stone and decaying leaves. Even a shifting of shadows. The low growl of Beavertail's voice was his first alert. "Show yourself." Joel's chest tightened as he strained to hear or see the threat Beaver had sensed. He could make out Beaver's form now that his eyes were adjusting to the dim interior, but only darkness lay beyond. Beaver's voice hadn't echoed through the space, so this cave must not be large. Joel stretched his right hand, the one gripping the knife, sideways as far as he could reach to see if his knuckles brushed the rock wall. His hand touched fur, and he nearly jumped even as he jerked his hand back. At the same moment, a tiny squeal, a gasp, filled the air. A shuffle sounded in front, just as a hard body slammed into him. I hope you enjoyed Hope in the Mountain River.